welcome back to the Centrist Guy Show. So today we're talking about the Columbia protests that are going on right now in New York and how I really feel that the mainstream media is trying to unfairly smear them as anti-Semitic. Starting off, it is not anti-Semitic to criticize the state of Israel. In fact, it's anti-Semitic to somehow say that all Jews support the government of Israel. That's generalizing amongst a group of people. I'm sorry. It would be similar to how if someone who is Muslim and they criticize the state of Saudi Arabia because they're Muslim fundamentalists. I mean, they have the morality police and they also behead people in the square. That somehow is Islamophobic. It's not Islamophobic to criticize a government because you don't have to agree with the government's actions in which they're taking. I do think the protesters had to actually police themselves because if you get the wrong group of assholes who come in there and actually believe in some of the radical shit of being actual pro-Hamas, pro-October 7th, you got to throw them out of the protest, period. Obviously, the mainstream media is all for this war at this point. They kind of tentatively say, like, hey, we're kind of getting a little worried about all these civilians being killed. And then they just kind of go on, be like, well, I guess it's just the way it is in the United States. We just support Israel no matter what they do. It is not anti-Israeli to say, hey, I do not agree in the way they're waging this war. I'm not asking Israel to actually not deal with the situation of Hamas, which they actually propped up. All of a sudden, we have to just agree with whatever way they wage their war. I mean, there's like the Where's Daddy's program that literally targets people who are suspected to be Hamas, wait for them to go home, and then kill their entire family members. I remember when everyone's hair was on fire when Donald Trump said we shouldn't go after the terrorists only, we should go after their family members. Well, they're actually doing it. It seems like it's okay whenever the certain people are in charge. That's why they just hate Trump. They just hate Trump because he's a bad face for the United States. And there's even alumni who are pulling their funding from Columbia University. That's where the real power is, because I don't know how much longer these protests are actually going to last, and they're just probably going to get all cleared up because the money says so and they need to go. Kind of harkens back to like the anti-Vietnam War protests, as far as I'm sure they were smeared too, and I'm sure they had people in there who were pro-North Vietnamese and saying like, hey, we support the North Vietnamese, and then they just smeared the protests, and then eventually they just come and get arrested. It's interesting how history just seems to repeat itself. The only difference is we can actually see it on our phones versus like actually watching the TV. And that's what the mainstream media doesn't like anymore. They don't like online media because people are independent and they don't actually have to listen to advertisers. Interesting how the White House has come out and condemned these protests, even though they said they're trying to get the voters back in Michigan because, you know, Joe Biden might lose Michigan, then there's a good chance he might lose the election. And he's trying to make it up in other places, but if he loses Michigan, he's going to have a hard time getting enough electoral votes to become president. The message is clear that the United States will never stand up to Israel at this point. We even told them not to attack Iran after we protected their ass, and then they attack Iran anyways. And it just seems like Joe Biden's like one of the weakest presidents I've ever seen. He's literally telling states like who we support, hey, you can't do this action, we're not going to support that action. Then they do the action, and then you support them anyway, so you just kind of embolden them. And even Bibi Netanyahu, who's the prime minister of Israel right now, his polling numbers are going up, probably because his people are seeing like, hey, he's just standing up to the United States and doing whatever he sees fit for us, so I mean, how can we really be against him? He got us $26.4 billion. Why would we feel that he's doing a bad job if he just got us $26.4 billion? It's sad to see that I call them the powers that be can just do whatever they want, and they'll smear whoever they had to smear in order to protect themselves. They hate Trump so much, they're like throwing the book at him. I mean, we have the case going on right now with Stormy Daniels. I don't know about you. I think the average voter doesn't give a shit that he paid off a porn star to keep an affair quiet. I don't give a shit. I don't think anyone gives a shit. I do think the classified documents case is a little worse, and then we have like the election subversion case in Georgia. So those cases are actually what matters. But as far as like the weakest case is concerned, they're parading this out right before the election. And I think they're banking on it. Just it ruins the image of Trump so much to see him in a courtroom day in and day out that people will just end up supporting Joe Biden by default because they're like, well, we don't want to support a criminal. I think Trump is being singled out because he is who he is. As far as like, if he didn't run for president again, I don't think any of these cases would have been brought against him. I think all of these would have been like, hey, just stay out of politics. We're not interested anymore. You're one of the elite. You were president once, so just get the fuck out of here. But since he's running again, now they're bringing all these cases to him, and it appears political. Because if you actually believe that he was doing wrong, you You should have went after him immediately after he left office, and they didn't do that. They just let him go. Now, publicly, it just appears political and a witch hunt, and to some extent, I do think it is a witch hunt against Trump. I'm not a Trump voter, by the way. I don't support Donald Trump, but I can also recognize that the powers that be just hate Trump, and they're trying to get rid of him. And that may even empower him even more, and he might become president again. In my opinion, I think Trump would be a standard Republican all over again. They say, hey, Donald Trump's going to deploy the National Guard for the BLM riots, when actually people were looting and destroying cities. And they were like, well, look, if he does that, he's a fascist, he's a dictator. If they actually deploy the National Guard to break up these protests, stop saying that Trump is somehow a dictator and like he's going to take over and get rid of democracy and stuff like that. The worst I think Trump would be is just an acceleratory agent of this. And it would be out in the open instead of just like the charades we go through every 4 years being like, hey, there's wildly different ideas on both sides. That's not true. They always agree on war. They always agree on the security state and NSA spying. There's really no difference anymore with any of these presidents at this point. I mean, you might get a different tax rate. You can call it the uni party, because we're doing these charades every 4 years pretending like, hey, there's going to be real big change. And I kind of lost hope after President Obama, who was not someone who I saw as real corrupt, but he continued the security state like everyone else. And he did do some good things like the Iran nuclear deal, I agree with, in order to try to prevent a war with Iran. But any president, any Republican president would have came and ripped up that deal. I'm just going to leave it at that. So the Columbia University people, keep going. Try to police yourselves. Keep an eye out on people who are obviously just agitators or just either misinformed or just ill-intentioned.